So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Etincelle series of seminars of CSL Paris. Today, our guest is Laura Alessandretti from Technical University in Denmark. It's a real pleasure to have Laura with us tonight. She just published a very, very interesting paper on Nature about the scales of mobility. And we'll hear more about this, but let me just spend 1 minute to say something about Laura. I guess this will interest the audience. So Laura, she's a physicist by background. She took a master in, I have an echo? No, okay. Master in physics of complex systems in Lyon, France at the École Normale Supérieure. And then she got the PhD in applied mathematics, if I don't go wrong, at the City University of London, under the supervision of our well-known Andrea Baronchelli and Sune Lehmann. And now, as I said, I mean, she's assistant professor at Technical University in Denmark with many different activities. We just learned that actually she's been collaborating with the Danish task force anti-COVID-19. And I guess she's also working, at least partially, for UNICEF, the office in Lund. I mean, always, I guess, connected to COVID. I mean, fighting COVID. And I guess her scientific interest spans, I mean, many domains, but mainly human behavior monitored through, I mean, high frequency and high resolution data, and of course, I mean, combining data science and modeling. So without further ado, I mean, I look forward to hear from you, Laura. The floor is yours. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Vittorio. It's also a very big pleasure for me to be here. Yeah, this was not possible in person, of course, but still, it's amazing that we can still get to do this. So I will now share my screen, and hopefully everything works well. Can you see my first slide?
Perfect.
Okay, great. So yes, as Vittorio introduced, I'm going to talk to you today about one of my latest works that got recently published in Nature on scales in human mobility. I do work on human mobility, as Vittorio mentioned, and I would just like to briefly cover why do people even care about studying and understanding how people move. Of course, many people figure out recently that by knowing where we move, we get better at forecasting epidemics, and this is because viruses spread via people, and when people move, they can bring the virus elsewhere. So this is one of the reasons why scientists aim at being better at characterizing and modeling human mobility. But also there's many other applications, and some include forecasting traffic, planning transport, and designing cities. So human mobility has been a topic that has been studied for a very, very long time. Yeah, and this paper is sort of like a milestone in my research on mobility. So I'm really, really happy to see this published. It got published last week, and to be here and discussing this with you. If I was coming to Paris to give you this talk about scales in mobility, I would have to travel from Copenhagen for a bit more than 1,000 kilometers, right? And if instead Vittorio had invited me in Rome, in Italy, at Sapienza, I would have to travel 1,500 kilometers, or a bit more than that. But in reality, that would not make much of a difference for me, because I would have to take a plane and come over. So even though there's a massive difference in terms of distance, and probably also some difference in terms of how much it takes, I would not really start thinking about, oh, maybe I'm not going to Rome, or yes, I'm going to Paris. It doesn't make much of a difference for me to travel to Paris or to Rome, because I consider that both Paris and Rome are within Europe, so are sort of at the same scale distance from where Copenhagen, right? And this is really like the way we think about mobility, like in terms of spatial scales. So say we want to grab like a coffee, we are at the office, those times where we could still be at the office and grab coffee, we would probably be able to find a coffee somewhere like within our building and sort of like navigate within the building and find a coffee. So it doesn't matter if it's like one floor above, one floor down, it's in the same building. It's kind of like easy to go and grab a coffee. And if instead we want to like find a nice restaurant, that's something we can find typically like in our neighborhood. So we go out in our neighborhood and we can't like find a nice restaurant where we go. And if instead what we want to do is like going maybe to the theater or something, that's something we can find within the city. And so on and so forth. Like you can think of like if you want to go and catch a plane and travel to another country, then you would find an airport somewhere in the sort of like urban agglomeration that surrounds the city where you live. And further, like another like scales, of course, is the country. So within the country is we can sort of travel and use the same currency and go on holiday, and it's easy to move. And then the continent is also, as I've explained before, like another scale that sort of like embed our movements. And the fact there's like different maps at different scales really makes clear that this is the way we think about space and moving between places. And this was even proven sort of like by cognitive scientists that the way we represent space and we organize like what are called cognitive maps in our brain are sort of like in this hierarchical levels of different places. And this is sort of always also what geographers have always theorized about mobility. So the idea is that one of the points of agreement between geographers and ecologists has always been that different processes operate at different scales, from the household to the neighborhood to the town to the country up to the world. And those different scales must be studied accordingly. So identifying these scales is one of the challenges in research. This concept of scale has been like recurrent in geography, in the study of geography and ecology. Now, in recent years, the way we study human mobility has changed dramatically. And the reason is that we have access to massive, large-scale data sets collecting trajectories of millions of individuals worldwide. And what has been found is that there are no scales in human mobility. So the theory says that there must be scale. Our intuition suggests there must be scale. Cognitive scientists say we think of space in terms of scales. And then when we look at like all the papers that were published in the, say, last 15, 20 years about human mobility, you can see here I collected some, and in the titles we see words appearing such as scaling laws, scaling properties, scaling identities, scale free. Those set of words all mean the same things. It's like there are no scales in empirical mobility traces. And this is what has been found more like empirically by looking at actual traces of people. Now, what does this even mean? What does scale-free even mean? What you see here is basically the sort of data that I work with and that we work with. It's just like points moving in space and time. And one of the ways that we characterize these trajectories or these traces in space and time is by computing what we call the length of displacements and the duration of stays. So we can take a trajectory and make sense of it by seeing like where a person stops and for how long it stops there, and then like how far this person traveled before going elsewhere. So we have these sequences of what we call delta R and delta T. So the length of the displacements between one location and the following, and the duration of stay. So how long do I stay somewhere before moving elsewhere? And these are quantities that we can easily compute, or more or less easily. And we can see how the probability distribution delta R and delta T look like. Now here is exactly where the scale freeness of traces comes in, because what has been found is that especially in the tail, these distributions are well described by power law functions. So this is one of the first large papers that was published in Human Mobility, Understanding Individual Human Mobility Patterns, and then many other papers found the same. So the power law distributions, I put like the definition here below, are like a specific type of distribution that has no characteristic scale. So the reason is simply that when you scale the input of the power law function by a constant, then what you have is that the output is simply the same function scaled by another constant. So we don't see characteristic scales in power law distributions. And for these reasons, scientists have said, okay, we have this distribution of displacements and we see no specific typical scales arising from these traces that we are observing. Now, there is some level of debate in the literature about the power law distribution of mobility traces. So here I've collected a number of papers that have addressed this topic. So each line in this figure is a paper. The length of the line is sort of the range of displacements that the study has considered, and the line is colored based on what type of function they have found to describe the best distributions of displacements and waiting times. And you can see that in most cases, power laws were found as the best distribution to describe mobility patterns. Now, for this reason, the models that scientists use to generate synthetic traces that should be like sort of similar to individual movements assume that there are scaling laws and there are power law distribution of displacements. Here, I want to briefly describe one of the state-of-the-art model that is called the exploration and preferential return model that is used to generate synthetic traces. So we imagine that there is an individual in a given location at a given time t, and this individual knows a number of locations, let's say 4. Those are the locations where the person has been. Now, this person will stay there for a certain amount of time, and the model assumes that the amount of time the person stays there is extracted from a power law distribution. And then with a given probability, this person will explore a new location. And this location is far from the location where the person is, delta r. So it's distance delta r from the place where the person actually is. And this delta r is again extracted by a power law distribution. Why? Because this is the distribution that we see in the data. With a complementary probability, the person will not explore, will return to a place where he or she has been before. But without focusing on the details, what matters here is that we have these power law distributions that are core elements of the model. So empirical results show that there are scaling laws, scale-free distribution. We put the scale-free distributions in the model. But can we reconcile our intuition that there are scales, the theory that suggests that there are scales in space and they affect the way we move, and this empirical finding? This is what we were aiming to do with our work. Now, the first intuition we had is maybe scales are there, but they are simply very hard to see. Here I show you the cover of one edition of the New York Times in 1976. Shows this like beautiful representation or illustration of New York, where you can actually see that like the scales that you potentially have, like from the building level, the street level, up to the neighborhood and the city level, then to the region and the country, just like we have seen at the beginning. So the scales are there, but there are many. So maybe they're simply very hard to see. And in fact, maths seem to suggest that this could be the case, right? Because let's take a distribution that has a very characteristic typical scale, like a Gaussian distribution, that has a very well-defined mean and standard deviation. And let's instead take 6 Gaussian, so many of them with different standard deviations and different means. And let's take the aggregation of these Gaussians. Let's put them together. These are different probability distributions. We just take the aggregation of the probability distributions. And let's look at these distributions in log-log scale. So with the x-axis, we put like a log scale, and the y-axis, we put a log scale. And this is what it's typically done to observe power law distributions, because power law distributions look like straight line on a log-log scale. And then let's keep adding Gaussian distributions with more and more Gaussian distributions. We can immediately see that at some point, when we aggregate enough Gaussian distributions, we end up observing a power law distribution in the tail of the aggregated probability distribution. So it seems like it could be the case that simply by aggregating distributions have a typical scale, we could end up having a power law. And we have, to explore this better, we have an interactive visualization of this phenomenon that you can explore online. I can share the link later, where basically we show how this process can emerge not only from Gaussian, but even from many other distributions that have a typical scale, a typical characteristic scale. Okay, so it could be that in fact there are many scales, but they're hard to see. How can we find these scales in human trajectories? It seems like it's really hard. People haven't managed so far. We took a modeling approach. We designed a model, an agent-based model, where individuals move between this nested structure of containers. So for each individual, space is organized like a nested structure of containers, from rooms to buildings to neighborhoods, cities, and countries. And this structure shapes the way that an individual moves. So how does this model work? It has three core elements. So the first key element is this hierarchical partitioning of space. The second element is what we call the attractiveness of each container, because it's well known in the literature that some places are more attractive than others for a certain individual. So say the home location is much more attractive for an individual than any other place. And then we have a probability of transitioning between different levels. So it is more likely for an individual to transition at the lowest hierarchical level, so say like within a room, compared to how likely it is to move between, say, countries. So we have this distribution of transitioning between different levels across the structure. And these are the three core elements. Now we have this agent-based model where individuals move in the structure according to these simple mechanisms. So first of all, individuals choose at which level to move. So say move within a room, move within a city, move within a country. And then secondly, they choose the destination. So given that they choose to move within their neighborhood, they would choose a specific destination within their neighborhood. So again, we have developed an interactive visualization to sort of make this model a little bit more clear. And I will quickly go through it, and then I will give you the link so that you can explore yourself. So in the simplest form, this hierarchical structure is a grid. Now, we don't use a grid in the actual paper, but in the simplest form, and for like just showing an example, the nested structure is a grid with a certain number of levels and with a certain number of locations per level. And then we can simply generate traces using these mechanisms that I'll show you. Here in the visualization, you can even see them live, how an individual would move between different locations in this grid. And remarkably, these traces look very much alike the traces that we see in the real world. So, for example, here on the left, you have a trace, a synthetic trace generated by this container model, we call it. And on the right, you have the distribution of displacements corresponding to this trace, so the probability of traveling at any given distance. We have colored actually the bins in this probability distribution because we have displacement at different levels. So we have displacement at the lowest hierarchical levels, that are the blue displacements. We have displacement at the second to lowest hierarchical level, is the orange bins, and so on. Now, let's imagine for a second that we had a trace where we didn't know the colors. So let's imagine we had a black trace. We didn't know what were the different levels. And this is exactly what happened when we have an empirical trace. How can we recover these colors? How can we recover the different levels in this trace? In order to do it, we simply write down the likelihood of a trace under the container model. So let's imagine what all we see is just a sequence of places. And let's imagine we had a candidate model, so a candidate set of containers, attractivenesses and probabilities, which specify fully our model, as we've seen in the start. We can compute the probability to transition between any location I and j, given this candidate model. And we can compute the likelihood of the entire trace by computing the product of the probabilities that we observe in our empirical trace. So this is what we can do. And we see on the synthetic data that we can perfectly recover the original structure, so the original colors, by making sure that this likelihood is maximum. So we find the candidate model that has largest likelihood, and we recover perfectly the colors that we use to generate the synthetic trace. Now, if you're seeing where we're going, the idea now is that we can simply do this with real-world data. We can simply take real-world data and find the hierarchical structure of containers for individual empirical traces. So we took a large-scale dataset that consists of 10 million trajectories collected worldwide. We filtered the dataset to make sure we only keep like very good traces with very high resolution. The dataset is long, so the collection started in 2015 and ended in 2019. The dataset has global coverage, so individuals are located worldwide. It has very high temporal and spatial resolution and a lot of metadata associated. So we know the gender and age of individuals. We also took other data to corroborate our results. One is the Copenhagen Network Study dataset that collects the traces of students involved in an experiment run in Copenhagen, and then some traces that were donated by friends to sort of visualize and further corroborate our results. Now, this is a real-world mobility trace, and we will try to play the game that I showed you before. So we'll try to maximize the likelihood and find the best model to sort of identify this structure of containers. So the way we do it is that we first start by finding the first level of containers. We have seen that containers are nested. So first we find the first level of containers, and then by minimizing the negative log likelihood, and we keep adding levels to sort of find like the optimal structure that better describes our trace. And this means that we can actually color the trace. So we can actually find for each displacement at which level distance it occurred. Is it a displacement between at the lowest hierarchical level or the second to lowest hierarchical level, and so on. And further, we can find this nested structure of containers. So here it's actually the trace of a person who agreed to share the visualizations. And what we can show is basically that this person has some containers in Copenhagen. At the lowest hierarchical levels, we sort of have small neighborhoods. At the second to lowest hierarchical levels, we have cities. At the third hierarchical level, this person's containers corresponds to urban agglomeration. At the fourth level, this person's containers corresponds to region / countries, and so on. And I've actually I can also share here a more like interactive visualization where we can also see actually the continent is the same individual. We have the purple containers are the continents. The red containers are regions or / countries. And then we have urban agglomeration, cities, and neighborhoods. And the cool thing is that we can play this game for every single individual in this large-scale data set of 10 million individuals and find the hierarchical structure of containers for each single of them. Now, what do we find? The first thing is that human trajectories are characterized on average by 4 hierarchical levels. And secondly, there are typical scales across the populations under study. So what does that mean? Is that when we look at the size of these containers, the typical size of this container at different hierarchical levels, we plot the distribution across individuals, we find that this distribution is not scale-free, but rather there is a typical characteristic distance. And this typical characteristic distance corresponds roughly to the sizes of neighborhoods, cities, and urban agglomerations and regions. Why do we actually care about this? Why do we care about the fact that there are scales? This resolves like a paradox in the literature, but why is this important? The first reason is that having a model that describes well the traces allows us to generate much more realistic traces compared to previous models. So what we did is that we used somehow like a machine learning approach to show this. And we used like a year of data to train our model for each individual and to find the hierarchical structure of containers for each individual. And then we generated 50 new movements for each of them. And finally, we compared the properties of the synthetic traces generated by the hierarchical models, container models, and unseen data. How do our synthetic traces match or are similar to unseen data? So we used some of the properties that characterize trajectories to show the performance of our model against the previous model. What you can see here in black, the black line is the distribution of displacements, so the probability distribution of displacements. We have talked about it before, and the black line corresponds to actual data. So this is a real-world probability distribution of displacements. And then the blue line is the probability distribution of displacements predicted by the EPR model, exploration preferential return, that I described to you previously. And the orange line is the distribution instead generated by traces, synthetic traces generated by the synthetic model, by the container model. So we can see that the container model outperforms the state of the art in terms of generating a realistic probability distribution of displacements. And we can look at other quantities. So one of the quantities that people look at in human mobility is the so-called radius of gyration that I define here in the bottom of the slides. It's a quantity that measures the extent of an individual's whereabouts. So how large is your typical mobility? So how many kilometers does one person cover typically? And what they have found is that when you look at this radius of gyration, starting from a given time 0 over time, you have like an increase, but then you sort of have a saturation when you observe an individual for a very long time. And again, what you can see is that when you plot the real world evolution of the radius of gyration in black, and then you use the evolution of the radius of gyration by synthetic traces generated by the container and the EPR model, again, you find that the container model describes much better this quantity compared to the EPR model. So for the EPR model, the radius of gyration grows much, much faster. Another quantity is the frequency rank plot of locations. So this is also a quantity that has been looked at by researchers studying mobility. Same thing, the container model describes this much better than previous models. And the final one is the difference between the uncorrelated and the temporal entropy of traces. So these are two key quantities that basically describe how predictable is a sequence of locations. And it's been found that these quantities are not the same. So the uncorrelated entropy only looks at sort of the probability of visiting any given location, while the temporal entropy actually cares about sequences of locations. And these two quantities are different, as it was shown by a very famous paper, Limits of Predictability in Human Mobility, because we tend to have some kind of like regularities in the way we visit locations. So we tend to, say, go to home and work one after the other very regularly. And that's a sort of pattern that it's observed a lot. And for this reason, the temporal entropy differs to the uncorrelated entropy. So the difference between the two, again, is better described by the container model compared to the EPR model, as you can see in this figure. So we have shown that against many different properties of the trajectories, this container model performs much better than the state of the art. And we have actually compared with a range of models. So not only the exploration and preferential return, but also other ones, and found that this is the case across these different models. A second reason why this model is important is because it allows us to understand some heterogeneities and differences across individuals in the way they behave and they move that we could really characterize before. And some examples include differences between genders, so between males. And what I found is that basically the mobility for women has a much smaller extent, which means that the size of their containers tend to be smaller. However, the complexity of individual trajectories for women is larger because women tend to have more scales or more levels in the hierarchical structures compared to males. And in fact, this is not the same across countries, but in certain countries, this difference is more pronounced than in others. So what you can see here on the left is the difference in the number of scales for males, which are the blue lines, and females, which are the red lines, in different countries. The column on the left correspond to countries where this difference is more pronounced, and those are Saudi Arabia, India, Turkey, and United Arab Emirates. While on the right, we have the countries such as this difference is less pronounced, such as Norway, Denmark, Switzerland, and Ireland. And in fact, what we find is that this gender gap, so in number of scales, correlates very well with the gender inequality index, which is something that has nothing to do with mobility, but it's simply an index that has been designed to measure differences in opportunities in a given country. So basically, like we can see from the mobility traces that there is a difference that reflects the differences in opportunities in different countries. Sorry. A second aspect that we focused on is the differences between individuals who live in urban areas and in rural areas. So here what you see on the left is containers for an individual who lives in the countryside, and on the right, the containers for an individual who live in a city that we have seen before. And we find that people living in rural areas have larger containers compared to people living in urban areas. And this is sort of not just, this is an example, but then when we look at the distribution, we see like all over the world, we have this massive difference in size of containers for urban and rural individuals. So again, the container model allowed us to show something that we couldn't observe otherwise in terms of specific differences in mobility between different people. And the third aspect we focused on is the effect of walkability. Walkability is an index, is a score that characterizes the environment, in this case around an individual's home location. And places that are walkable, highly walkable, are typically places where there's lots of like pedestrian streets and they're friendly for pedestrians, there's many shops and so on. So are places where people would actually walk. Instead, places with low walkability are places where typically you wanna have a car to go anywhere because there's not many shops, there are no pedestrian areas, and so on. And again, what we find is that the size of containers correlate with the walkability index. So the more walkable is an area, and the smallest the size of containers. The less walkable is an area, the larger are the containers, meaning that in order to access opportunities and points of interest, you need to sort of travel further. So the size of your what we call neighborhoods is larger. So to sum up, we have presented a new model that allowed to show that human mobility is characterized by spatial scales. And we're now able to unveil these scales using the container model. This work helps understand human movements and heterogeneities across individuals, and it helps us generate synthetic trajectories that are really highly realistic. And we also show that we actually do not overfit because we have sort of adopted the machine learning approach to show that our synthetic traces match well with unseen movements that we haven't observed before. This work has been published in Nature, as I said before, and we were very happy about it. It was a very long journey that took many years to develop, and it was also a lot of fun. It was done in collaboration with Sune Lehmann and Ulf Aslak from DTU and KU. And I would also like to point out some of my other works in mobility here in the slides, in case you're interested. You're very welcome to read them and ask me questions. Contact. Feel free to drop me a message anytime, and I'm happy to answer any questions right now. It's very hard for me to give a seminar without seeing you, but it was. I hope you liked it, and I hope I managed to. And now I go back to the. Yes, here I am, and I can see you all again. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Laura. This was fascinating, really, really exciting. It seems, I mean, you're casting, I mean, year zero, a new year zero in the study of mobility. A real milestone. I mean, thanks a lot. I mean, a lot of suggestions. I mean, I'm sure there will be many questions, but let me start with one observation. I know, I mean, Sune in the past few days, I mean, when it was advertising this paper, said, I mean, if you are fed up with papers about COVID, please read this paper because it's not about COVID. It's a very interesting one. And no, but still, I mean, my question would be, I guess, I mean, with these tools, I mean, you can actually investigate, I mean, what happened during the COVID phase. I mean, how this compartment changed. I mean, in which way, I mean, this structure has been somehow disrupted. And now, for instance, the predictability has changed. I don't know whether you did already something along these lines.
I haven't, but it's planned. So
yes,
it's a very good suggestion. It's a very good point. This way of modeling the traces really does provide like a new angle, a new key to model and understand and make sense of the traces. And we think it will really help like describe what has happened during the pandemic in different countries, and how basically people reacted to the restrictions that were imposed in different countries. So by using this tool, we can basically like better like characterize and understand what has happened, but we haven't yet. But it's really one of the things that we are working on. So.
Yeah, I look forward to this. Then I'm very glad, I mean, that you really were able to reconcile, I mean, this idea of the scale free with what we know about actual mobility, at least the impression we have, I mean, the way in which we perceive space. And of course, I mean, this is culture dependent. And I'm glad, I mean, you did something also across different cultures. So I leave the floor to others, but I have just one observation, which I'm very much intrigued by the way in which you can actually put your finger on, in general, inclusion and heterogeneity in mobility. You mentioned gender, but I'm pretty sure, I mean, there will be many different ways in which people can actually differently included, I mean, in mobility. You mentioned, of course, rural versus urban areas, but already in urban areas, I mean, being at the center or in the outskirts, I mean, could make a difference. And of course, I mean, many different social aspects can actually change. So I guess this is just a suggestion. Probably you already planned all this, but this would be very interesting to look at, I mean, as a kind of study. I guess, I mean, now it's time, I mean, to ask questions to Laura. You can either write on the chat or just, I mean, step up and ask.
Who's there?
Vito, go ahead.
Okay. So a couple of questions. One, probably you already answered. So when I see the curves that you showed, actually your model is outperforming all the others, mainly the EPR. And I immediately thought that it could be kind of overfitting, but you said that you proved that it is not, right? I mean, you have a model where I guess there are, since this model, there are many parameters, and this then having many parameters can be dangerous in some sense.
Yes, absolutely. It could be, but it's not in the sense that we we showed that. So the curves that I showed you are based on like unseen data. So overfitting happens when your training error is small, but then your testing error is large. And here instead, the testing error is small, or it's smaller than what you have using other agent-based model to generate the trajectories. So in the sense, it is not overfitting. It is more complex than the EPR, for sure. But it's also somehow different in scope, because the EPR was very much focused on the temporal aspect. So the EPR model focuses on understanding this interplay between exploration and exploitation. And our model instead really focuses on the spatial aspect. So in principle, they could be merged, the two models, because all we're interested in is sort of having a model where the power law, it's not like a core element of the model, like it's not just built in, but it's something that comes out from the way people move.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I hope this answered, but and feel free to ask more.
Bernardo, please.
Yes. I have another question. Maybe I don't know if I missed it, because at some point I lost the sound. But so you can infer the different scales. So basically, special clusters for different movements of individuals from your dataset, if I forget it correctly. And this cluster somehow resembles different scales, organizational scales of space, like you said, neighborhoods, cities, and so on and so forth. So my question is, if you overlap the same scales of different individuals, for example, the city scales of different individuals, does this overlap somehow, or the union of all the areas that you found resemble somehow the borders of the city, for example, or the borders of different neighborhoods within the city?
Yes, this is super interesting, and it's also one of the first things that I tried, but we couldn't find like clearly by trying quickly what you're saying, and this is because there's so much heterogeneity that you end up having if you use like a network approach to sort of if you model a container as nodes in a network and links as the overlap between two containers, then you end up having a structure with no clusters, with no actual structure, but
I see.
like a randomly connected graph. So we couldn't do it like very quickly, but I bet we should think more about it, because it would be indeed very interesting to use this system to find like a definition of neighborhoods and cities that it's not just like administrative definition, but it comes out from the way people move, and it's shared across individuals. But by looking at this very quickly, it seems like each individual's neighborhoods are very different.
Okay. As you may imagine, there was this problem with defining the city boundaries, and maybe your approach can really give a contribution there. But okay, thank you for the question, for the answers.
I fully agree with you, and we should think more about this and how to actually do it.
Okay, thanks.
Are there other questions or comments?
Can I? Sorry. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. My question was about the model. I think that more than overfitting, the problem of overfitting, the question may be how stable is this arrangement of clusters and of containers, sorry, in time for people. And my question is, I didn't get it from the talk. Maybe I missed it because it was a lot of stuff. But you fit the model on each individual per se. And so my question is, how can it deal with an expanding space? I mean, people can only explore clusters and containers that they saw in the past, or the model accounts also for new venues and the possibility to expand the space that an individual explores?
Yes, these are very good points. Thanks. It doesn't cope with exploration. So this is also why I said from the beginning that it could be potentially like integrated with the exploration preferential return model, because that model was meant to was exploring like that type of question, and we were more interested in like just spatial distribution of places, but it doesn't cope with exploration. So it just like gives structure to locations that were seen before. And this is why when we do this like train and testing that I talked about, we focus on like short timescales. So the testing is like just 50, where we assume that exploration doesn't play a big role. Yes, and that's your second question. And sorry, I forgot the first, although I remember I had an answer.
No, you basically answered. My first question was that basically more than overfitting, the point is that this dynamic is quite stable in time, so yes, you can reproduce on a short scale the main observables. So the other question then arises is then when you test it against the new data, when you validate it, you're just looking at the spatial jumps, the spatial distances. You are not checking where the people actually goes. So you are not like giving a score on the actual stops he does on the ground, meaning how much how much I'm getting the actual stop he will make in time. I don't know if the question is clear. Sorry.
Yes. No. So what we present in the paper is these like aggregated properties. So the radius of gyration and the distribution of displacements. So it's not actual like accuracy on the location, if that's what you meant. But we also tried that, and that also works. And of course, you just need to figure out how to account for exploration. Yeah. And if I remember, we basically just like had our model like penalized compared to the EPR for somehow for not when you would predict a wrong location.
Yeah. Okay.
And the EPR would always perform like correctly if it correctly predicted an exploration. And we tested that for just like 50 displacements trace, but we haven't included in the paper. We only have these like aggregated properties presented.
Okay, thank you very much.
So Laura, along the same lines of exploit and explore, because you mentioned you have data across a long time, right? 4 years, something like 2015, 19. So is the structure of the container stable across the year? So for instance, if you perform the analysis only on 1 year and then the year after and the year after, is still, because this could be a way to grasp also this exploring feature, right? I mean, the idea that the number of containers can actually grow in time in principle.
Yes, so here we have considered like a whole year. So in a sense, you have a sort of like aggregated average behavior over a year. And the reason is that we wanted to like capture also maybe like recurrent like long-term trips that occur like multiple times. And those occur more rarely. So say like you go on holiday several times to the same area, you want to capture that, and for that you need like long-term scales. But so we don't have this like we haven't really looked in detail into those like evolutions of containers. But what we have done is that like the output or the result that we have is generated by bootstrapping the trace. So in a sense is stable in the sense that it's the synthesis of many like repeated trials over subset of the trace, so that we have something that is the most as stable as possible. And definitely I assume that if we looked at like shorter time scales, we would observe some kind of like evolution. So here we grasp like more longer temporal structures, and if we went down and looked at the scales of months, we would probably capture some kind of evolution.
Okay, well, I guess it would be interesting to look at it. And then a very technical question. So how do you define the displacement? Because I guess, I mean, people should stop somewhere for, I mean, enough time to declare that the journey is over, right? Did you put a threshold on this?
Yes, yes, and we have checked against like different thresholds.
Yeah.
It's the threshold that we ended up like presenting in the main results is like 20 meters. So when an individual doesn't move more than like 20 meters away, then that's considered like a stop location. But we have tested against different thresholds, and this also gives me the chance to introduce a library that we have on top of the library that we describe in the paper to find the containers and the scales. We also have a library to find stop locations. It's called InfoStop, and it's based on the it's a little bit different than what people typically do to find stops, because we use InfoMap to detect stop locations. So it's also a very technical thing. But if people are interested in finding stops from GPS trajectories, you can check it out and also contact me.
Okay, but perhaps, I mean, if you wish to send us links, I mean, to put on our webpage of seminars, so perhaps links, I mean, to your page of this kind of resources, that could be interesting. So feel free to send us these links. Are there any questions?
I had another question. Actually, it's very related to what Bernardo was asking, in the sense that, say you take all the persons in one city, Copenhagen, and then you scramble their trajectories, right? So at the end, I guess you will get a blurred definition of the first levels, but you might get something at the outer regional level. Did you try this?
No, but it's again exactly something that we thought of trying to get to that. So I think it's a very good idea, and could lead to what Bernardo was saying. Yes.
Thanks.
Okay, good. I guess we can close the session here. I mean, but before, I mean, we thank again very much Laura for this very interesting contribution. We look forward to welcoming you at the lab, I mean, as soon as this will be possible. And thanks a lot to the audience, and see you soon next week for the next Etincelle seminar. Okay, bye-bye to everyone.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Thank you.